It is my pleasure today to be talking with retired Associate Justice Rebacca Ann Wiseman of the Court of Appeal, 5th Appellate District. My name is Rosendo Pena, and I am an Associate Justice of that same court in Fresno. As part of the centennial of the California Courts of Appeal, the Appellate Court Legacy Project Committee is creating an oral history of our appellate courts and their justices. Good morning, Becky, and thank you for your participation. You capped off more than 27 years of judicial service when you retired from the Court of Appeal in October of 2013.
Halloween, by the way.
On Halloween. But before we get to your legal and judicial career, let's talk about your younger years. First, tell us where you were born and reared.
I was born in Sanger, California, and grew up in Fresno.
Tell us about your parents. What did they do?
My parents were very typical, I think, of their times. My mother was a homemaker, and my father had a very interesting life, which I will mention because I think it was so important in how I grew up and in shaping how I thought about things, even maybe influencing my judicial philosophy somewhat. But he was raised in a very small town in Arkansas that did not even have streets to it. It flooded all the time, and for him it was a really uncommon thing to have a pair of shoes because he was constantly skipping over water moccasins in that area. But he ran away from home when he was 16 years old and rode a rail to California, which is how the family ultimately ended up being in California. And because he had a brother who had already left Arkansas, he went to be with him in the central San Joaquin Valley. And so he lived with him, and that's how we got here.
And well, that's very interesting. What was his first job when he got here to the Central Valley?
Picking grapes, and then he went to driving truck. And I mean, the stories about going over the grapevine, losing the brakes, the hard work that he went through, the long hours, and that's what convinced him that he was going to not do that all his life. So he went to college, which was quite a deal, in between which he enlisted in World War II.
And I have read that your father was a glider pilot in World War II. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah, it's great stories. He still tells me, he's still living. He's 93 years old, and he still remembers those stories. But he was a glider pilot. He was in the mission that they made a movie about called Bridge Too Far, and was in with a plane. They were towing him, as they did with gliders, and they dropped him into enemy territory in Germany. And my dad was captured, as was the person that was with him, and they were taken in by a German family, and the Gestapo came and found them and murdered the family, and then took my dad off to prison camp. They actually murdered the man that was with my dad as well. And so Daddy spent, about 9 months in prison camp, and then fortuitously the war ended. And the stories he told are fascinating, one after another. And so anyway, he came back to the central San Joaquin Valley because that's where his roots had been established, finished college. He met my mother on an Amtrak train. They were playing cards, and I guess he likes to say he picked her up, and she didn't like that very much. She was pretty prim and proper. But anyway, that's how it started.
Now you mentioned that, how often would he talk about, this sounds like something that would obviously change a person's life. Did he talk about it often, or did he talk about it early on and then decided not to talk about it anymore?
Well, he was, I think, typical of many people of that generation. He didn't talk about it much until I remember until I got into college and after. And now he talks about it a lot more. Maybe as he's gotten older, he appreciates the value of the experience. And I think he can tell we really like hearing the stories, because if we don't hear them now, they will be lost. And they are not lost by any means, but he can go on and on with them. And his mind is still so clear, we don't hear them over and over again. It's nice. There's still new ones coming up all the time.
And as far as your mother, you said they met on an Amtrak train. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? That sounds pretty interesting to me. Where were they going? Where were they coming from?
They were, my mother was from Pennsylvania, and she came to Modesto, of all places. That seems pretty random to me, but she did. She got a job with the Department of Agriculture doing inspection of fruit, and they would inspect fruit to determine whether it had adequate sugar levels. And so my mother she had a degree in chemistry. She's a pretty sharp cookie and really enjoyed science. It was her gift. And so she had started in that role. She was on a train with friends. Back in those days, people traveled on the train a lot. It was a very social thing. And she was going back and forth to LA. And my dad was on the train with some other officer. My dad was a lieutenant. And so he thought she was pretty cute. That's how he put it. And so they went and started playing bridge. And that's how they met. And he got her phone number and came back to Modesto to look her up. It's not like he had the internet where you could find somebody on Facebook. He had to go pretty much walking through the streets of Modesto to find her. And he did.
Wow, that's very interesting. Now, you said that he went to the war, came back, finished college. So what did he end up working? What was his employment or his career after that?
Well, he worked for a company called Producers Cotton Oil Company, and it is located in Fresno, and it had gins, they call them gins, cotton gins, all over the central San Joaquin Valley. And he started as a gin manager, which my dad was a pretty quiet guy, and so I think it was helpful to him to learn how to talk, and part of the job was keeping the customers happy. So I still have a hard time thinking of my dad as being chatty, but apparently he developed that skill and then worked his way up into management. And in those days, people liked to work for one company. It's so different than now where you go different places, and staying at one job for 5 years might even be uncommon. But he was there 30 years, got his gold watch, and his reputation was that of, how's that phrase go, the velvet hammer. He was pretty tough.
Okay.
Growing up as a kid, you didn't mess with my dad.
And mentioning that, tell us about any siblings growing up here in Fresno. You said you were born in Sanger but grew up in Fresno. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe the schools that you attended in Fresno?
Yes, I attended local schools, public schools. I went to McLean High School. I have a sister, Joanne, who is, she was the beautiful one, tall and slender, and she is a fabulous person, also very scientific oriented. She ended up being a teacher, and a great teacher. She taught middle school by choice, and all the boys wanted to be in her class for no surprising reason. And anyway, she was great.
Did you teach in Fresno or in the San Joaquin Valley?
She taught at Sanger. Yeah. She's still there.
And during your early formal education, did you ever have to work as a student?
Oh, yeah. I've had a job since I was 12 years old, and my first job was working. My aunt was a court reporter at Fresno County Superior Court, and so she would give me her verbal notes, and then I would transcribe them for her.
So you type them up on a typewriter?
Yeah. I don't think I was very good. I think she had to go through and fix some of my mistakes, typos. But I remember the first case she gave me was something called a gang rape case, because my mother didn't know that's what it was. And I thought, oh, gang, what's that? And well, by the time I was through, I had a pretty good idea. It was probably not the best judgment to give a 12-year-old. But I got my initiation early. And then I worked at Liberty House, which was a department store.
I remember that.
Yeah, be comparable to a Macy's, I suppose. And it was a local chain. And I was the representative of a high school that I worked at. But that's where I really started enjoying public speaking. I would put on shows and presentations for them and learned how to speak extemporaneously.
And when you say put on shows, did this involve clothing? Or?
It did. And we would do it for various foundations and causes and raise money for organizations. Every high school had a person. At that time they were women, girls. Now I suppose they're all men and women. But we would put these presentations on, and it was great training. I'd never done anything like that before, and I liked it. I liked public speaking.
Great. So you graduated from McLean High School, and where did you go to college, and what was your major?
Went to Fresno State. Never really thought about leaving because Dad had always been home. And my major was journalism because I wanted to be a TV broadcaster. Never once thought about being a lawyer.
Now you said you only considered Fresno State at that time. Is there a reason for that?
Probably finances. We were obviously not wealthy people, and staying in Fresno seemed like a good idea. We didn't travel, so I hadn't had much exposure to other things in other places, and it was an economic choice.
And how did you become interested in journalism?
I just always was. Maybe because of the public speaking I did. I did forensics and debate, and I just liked it. I did. I liked Walter Cronkite. I thought, God, that's what I want to do. Barbara Walters. It just seemed like the most glamorous life possible.
So did you have that as an aspiration to maybe one day be either a newscaster or
yes.
behind the cameras?
Yes. I got my first job was out of college was with KOVR and in Sacramento, and worked in a newsroom.
What were your responsibilities or duties in the newsroom?
Oh, I was kind of a grunt. I was so grateful to get it. It was the 25th market in the United States, so it was a really great place to start. And I would file clippings. I mean, they would not even allow you to have a pad of paper. So that's where I learned to write on a typewriter. Everything. If the news director caught you with a legal pad or any kind of paper writing a story, he would rip it out and tell you to do it the right way. They didn't have time. They had deadlines. You have to learn how to do that. And it was great. That served me well. I've never written, when I was at the Court of Appeal, even on the trial bench, I don't think I ever had a legal pad. I did everything on the computer. Everything.
And so during your time at Fresno State, did you do any work anywhere to either supplement your income or to prepare yourself for your career? Yeah,
I always had a job. I worked in various jobs, but I think the most interesting one for me, I got a job in the summer at Sacramento. Woohoo, big city, and I thought that was great. And that's where I ultimately ended up meeting my husband. It was through that position. It was for the Secretary of Health and Welfare Agency, Earl O'Brien, who I thought was really cool at the time. He ultimately ended up in prison. So he was a medical doctor as well as a lawyer, and I think not the most honest person in the world. But that is how I got my start, and the first time I moved away from home and went to Sacramento and had a great time.
And was it at that time that you decided to go to law school, or did you already have that in mind?
Well, I actually decided to go to law school very randomly, which is sort of how I've done many things in my life, like applying for judgeships was kind of a random decision. I had a bad experience. I decided not to stay at the newsroom. I was unhappy because I didn't get a position that I had hoped that I would. Things often work out the way they should, but you don't know that at the time. And so I started applying for positions, and I had a friend call me and say that he'd been offered a job as an account executive with a public relations advertising firm. And I thought, well, it's not quite what I want, but it is in my field. So I applied, and I went in, and I had a pretty good resume. I'd done well in school and had, some awards and good grades. And so anyway, I thought, well, I should have a shot at this. And I went, and I was being interviewed by this young woman, and she kept asking me, now bear in mind, this was like 35 years ago, she kept asking me how fast I could type and how I was on the phone and these kind of questions. I said, well, this is all fine, but what position am I interviewing for? And isn't this the account executive position? And she said, oh, we don't have an account executive position open. This is for the receptionist. And I said, well, I know you do have an account executive position open because my friend, who I named, was just offered a position. And so she lied, and she said, well, yes, that's true, but we would never consider you for that position. And I said, why not? And she said, because you're a woman. Which, in retrospect, I give her credit that she was honest, because I do think those kind of things happen today, but people know you don't say it like that. Anyway.
Hearing that, her saying that, how did that make you feel?
Oh, it was, I wasn't happy about it. But what it did is I walked away from that and I talked to my husband. I said, I don't have a credential. Here I have this degree from college, and I've done well. And my friend, who I really like, he didn't have his credentials weren't the same as mine. I said, I need to get something where I don't always get asked as the first question, how fast you type. And that's when it occurred to me, maybe I'd go to law school. And it's funny, I had an offer. The same day I got accepted at UC Davis Law School, I got an offer to work at a newspaper and be an editor of one of their, it's like Parade Magazine, USA, one of those types of magazines for a Sacramento paper. And I just thought, oh, that sounds really good.
Is that a difficult choice for you to make?
It was, because I'd never once thought about being a lawyer. But that experience, getting back to your question, which is how did I react to that? I didn't ever want to have that happen again. And so I figured, fine, I will do this credential thing, and then I don't know if I'll ever practice, but nobody's ever going to ask me that again.
And you mentioned you got an offer from UC Davis. Did you accept that offer? Did you attend at UC Davis Law School?
I did.
And what year was that? Or years, I guess?
It would have been 1978, 77, right in there.
And we all have different experiences. How would you rate your law school experience?
I didn't like law school. I'm sorry, but I didn't. It was a means to an end for me. I had some classes that I really liked. I had a water law class that I thought was fabulous. But my law school experience was complicated by the fact that my husband moved to Kern County, which is 5 hours away to drive. And so I was driving back and forth every weekend. And I think that colored my experience because I was always frantic, just trying to keep my reading up. My first year, I had a great experience with classmates, wonderful friends from law school. But as far as the coursework, I think I wasn't really prepared for what was involved. I hadn't really thought through.
So if I were to ask you, was it what you expected? Is it you didn't have any particular expectations, or was it not what you expected? I
didn't really have expectations. I had no regrets having done it, but my goal in going was I wanted to be taken seriously. And I felt at that time as a young woman that was the way to do it. And so that was my motivation, and I had no regrets in doing it, and I still don't. But was it something I dreamed about all my life? We had no lawyers in the family, so it's not like I was trying to be like my dad. Or I have a cousin who went to law school, and we're it. So we didn't sit around the fire talking about torts. That's not how I was raised.
Now, you've mentioned a number of times your husband, Ken. Can you tell us about when you met, how you met, the backstory behind that? Yeah,
Ken's great. Yeah, you know Ken well.
I do.
He's just one of the nicest, interesting men. I say that after 37 years of marriage. I still think of him as one of the most interesting people I know. He makes anybody in a room feel comfortable. And yet he's no pushover, I'll tell you. But we met, we actually didn't hit it off. I didn't hit it off with him. We were at a political convention that I was at because of this position in Sacramento that I mentioned I'd taken. And I saw him there, and he was giving me a bad time. And I was passing out literature for this, he probably was more prescient than I, for this guy that went to prison. Of course, I didn't, obviously, there was no issue with that then, but he was running for office, which looking back on it was probably totally inappropriate to use state funds to hire interns to work with you. But I was passing this literature out, and I didn't want to be doing it, so I was kind of on edge, I think, anyway. And he came up and started teasing me. He didn't care for him. So he, once again, was able to see character where I didn't, and see lack of. And he gave me a bad time, and I told him, I said, buddy, you are cruising for trouble, because he was starting to push my button. And so anyway, it was maybe a month later that he was able to track down my address through one of my friends who was there.
He was like your dad then.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, he loves to tell the story. He's much better at it than I am. But we got married maybe a couple years later, or a year and a half.
And was this while you were in law school?
It was before law school.
Okay.
Yeah, we did law school together. Well, sort of. He moved to Kern County in the first year, so I was only with him on weekends.
And so I guess a lot of your time during law school had to deal with just being able to keep contact with him and meeting with him. I take it that.
Yeah, I got to know I-5 really well.
Well, let's move on to your bar examination. Do you remember anything about that?
Oh, yeah.
How you prepared for it?
Oh, I was like 24/7, because I knew one thing: I was not taking that again. So I stayed in Fresno with my parents, and the only thing, I mean, I took all the writing courses. I didn't want to take any chances. And the only pleasure I allowed myself was, I knew this is sort of sick, but Perry Mason used to come on. I love Perry Mason. And I don't want to say I didn't go to law school because of Perry Mason, because I never thought about going to law school, but I would watch Perry Mason at lunch, and that was my big moment that I would step away from studying. But I took it very seriously. And so I took the bar in San Francisco.
And where were you when you got the results?
I was at home and petrified. And that time you could find out by calling. And I didn't have the courage to call. And Ken said finally, it was like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the results came out at 10. He said, well, we've got to do this. I said, well, you call, I can't do it. So he called, and by then got through. And all I remember is hearing, we had an old screen door, and there's a very distinctive sound that screen doors make when they slam. You know it. And I heard that slam. I thought, oh, it's either good or it's not good. And he came running out, gave me a big hug, and I realized I'd passed. And then, this is so much my life, the guy across the street, who is named David, and we'd been friends, and he said, well, what are you so excited about? And I said, I just passed the bar. And I thought maybe he'd be happy. And he said, really? He said, don't you feel bad? And I said, no, I feel great. And he said, but don't you feel bad? You took a job away from some man trying to support his family. And I looked at him and I said, are you crazy?
Well, that's certainly not the reaction that I would have expected.
No, I didn't either. And it's funny, but that's how it was. I'll tell you, it didn't bother me. I was on cloud nine.
Were you in Bakersfield at this time? Or?
Yes.
Okay, and so this would have been a neighbor from Bakersfield. And after you took the bar, you moved in with your husband Ken in Bakersfield? Is that kind of how it happened? But you studied in Fresno.
I did. Well, I wanted to take a bar review course, and they didn't have anything in Bakersfield. So the closest I could get was Fresno, and it was a video kind of thing, but it was good. It worked.
So Do you feel that your marriage, did that impact your career path in any way?
Oh, yeah. Ken was the one, I've always been a reluctant warrior. I don't like spotlight. And he I worked for a firm, and I didn't care much for the firm. And then I went into the DA's office, and even there I took an unusual path in the DA's office. I did a lot of their civil litigation, which was fun, because my interest was water law. That's what I thought I was going to do. All right, now I'm a lawyer. I want to do water law. And so that's what I did. I was in the DA's office, but I handled environmental cases for them. When I wasn't sitting, I took a stint where I was out in the hinterlands, Buttonwillow and Shafter and Wasco.
All the outlying
yeah, I loved it. I loved it.
Kern County.
Yep.
So you mentioned that you did have, your first job, was it in a civil law firm?
Yeah.
What kind of work did they have you doing there?
Well, my boss was an engineer. And I realized that my perception of what water law was about maybe wasn't what his perception was. Because, I wasn't an engineer, and it was a little less exciting than I had hoped it would be. And so, and he was an interesting guy. So
and then you decided try public service, the district attorney's office there in Kern County.
I did.
I'm sure there's a lot to talk about there. Tell us a little bit more about your experience. You spent, at least 4 years or something there?
Yeah, I did. And that was with, I was hired by a DA named Al Letty, who was a very nice man. And Kern County's had some interesting challenges with its district attorney's office. And Ed Jagels ran for the office and ran against a sitting Kern County judge. And Ed won, and so I worked with him. And it was during that tenure that there were a lot of molest cases that came out of Kern that became rather notorious. I wasn't involved in any of those types of cases, but the way the prosecutions went and how those cases were developed did influence my judicial philosophy down the road. I felt there were some wonderful attorneys in that office, but that there was a lot of pressure put on people to be tough. And
you mentioned you were doing environmental law for the most part. What kind of prosecutions did that entail?
Toxic waste dumps, things like that. People in rural counties just go dump stuff, or they feel they can do whatever they want. Because it's open space, and there was even more open space then. So we did things like that, and consumer fraud cases. Those were fun.
So did you attempt to force them to clean up their messes or fine them?
We actually filed some public nuisance actions, which was fun. I don't mean to take... It was, as a young attorney, it was interesting, it was exciting. We were able to work with them and reach resolutions, which I think were for the public good. But it was exciting. It felt like we were making a difference.
Did you get a chance to do very many jury trials during the course of that time?
Yes, I did do jury trials. Not as many as some, but maybe 10 or 12 a year.
Did you enjoy that type of work?
Yeah, I did. It was the closest thing to, I sort of thought it was kind of like broadcast journalism. I liked being in front of people. And I'll tell you, I got certified as a law student. And my very first jury trial was, without any doubt, my most memorable, because I worked with, understudied a attorney, which you have to do. And it was an indecent exposure case. Again, why would they pick me to do this? I don't know, but I did. And there was a more pejorative way they described those cases, which you can probably imagine what it was. And so anyway, I did this case, and I remember Jack Rothstein calling me in and saying something right before we're going to pick a jury. He said, something very important I need to tell you. I said, okay. I'm thinking, all right, now he's going to give me sage advice about how to pick a jury. It's my very first one. And he says, my wife Emily and I have talked about you, and we've decided you use makeup very ineffectively. And I remember thinking, oh my God, can we have this conversation some other time? I said, I don't think the jury's going to care. And but I did learn the lesson of not asking one question too many. And I'll never forget this lesson. I have passed it along to people, anyone who will listen, where we had an indecent exposure case with an employee-employer situation, young employee, and it was in a shoe store. And the employer asked her to get a shoehorn and measure him. He was apparently exposing himself, and he wanted her to measure the length of his penis. And so apparently she did. Well, the young Rebacca Wiseman asked one question too many, and I didn't know the answer to the question. And I said, well, after that happened, what did you do? She says, well, we went to lunch. And I talked to the jury afterwards, and they acquitted. And they said this was consensual, this is stupid. And I should never have asked that question because I didn't know the answer to it.
Do you think that that result might have been something that would be different, say, in these days? Or
I don't
do you think
know.
the attitudes were different back then?
Well, in these days, I think that the company, which was a big company, would have gotten sued for sexual harassment, and it would have been a civil case. But yeah, it would be very different. But that's how, I guess, how people work. Nobody thought about that kind of thing. And certainly I didn't.
Now, you mentioned you were a certified law student at the time. So
Yeah.
And was this also in Kern County? Did you have a job there as a student before you worked there?
Yeah, I got a job at the DA's office. This was before I went to work for the civil law firm. I was there during the summer.
Oh, okay. And so, okay, you had a little bit of work there. Any office politics that you had to deal with at the district attorney's office?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was not an aggressive prosecutor. I was one that tended to want to try and resolve cases. And we had some people there that were extremely aggressive. One person I remember in particular garnered negative headlines over it, but took a case to trial because someone took a paper bag out of a grocery store.
So this is like petty theft?
Petty theft. And I thought that was stupid. When you start weighing public resources and yeah, so people like that and I, we didn't have the same philosophy about managing our cases.
But as far as your overall experience, would you say it was a positive one?
Oh,
How
yeah.
would you describe it?
It was wonderful. I enjoyed it very much, and I made lasting friends in that office, many of which went on to become judges. So we had relationships with each other, professional relationships for years.
And do you recall any special mentor or anyone that helped you out that you thought was really helpful to you?
From the DA's office,
Yes.
is Steve Gildner.
Oh, okay.
And we're still friends. He lives in Austin with his wife, Brenda. I still go see him. They're great people.
All right, and so now we can move on. When did you first become interested in applying for a judgeship?
Oh, my husband pushed me into it because, again, I've always been a reluctant warrior. I had no interest in becoming a judge because I was really liking working at the DA's office and doing this niche practice there. And Ken told me that you should put in for this, you might get it, and the worst thing that could happen, I'll never forget this line, it's what convinced me to do it, the worst thing that can happen is you'll get the job. And I thought, oh, okay, I can buy that. The implication being that you can say no. And I didn't really think I'd get the position anyway.
And so what year was it that you were first appointed as a judge, if you recall? Is that
It must have been like 86.
1986? And what judicial office did you hold at that time?
Municipal court. It was called West Kern Municipal Court. Marv Baxter called and told me. It was great. He was the judicial appointments secretary.
Yes, he's now retiring from the California Supreme Court.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
And do you remember anything about those days, your Muni Court days that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, I loved it. I understand the whole concept of unification. that being unifying superior and municipal court. But I sometimes regret that that happened because people that are young aren't really getting a chance to be judges. You have to be 10 years now before you can even be considered. And for the types of judgeships and responsibilities that you get, I think older attorneys are the ones that tend to get considered, which is as it should be if you're handling superior court work. But if you're doing a bunch of small claims and you're running a civil calendar and maybe doing just preliminary hearings, it's a great way to test out whether you like being a judge. It sure worked that way for me. And I loved it, as it turned out. I really did. I liked it. I think I was a better judge than I was a lawyer because I never liked that true advocacy position. I like more, let's talk about this. Let's figure out how we can make this work. And that suited my personality more.
And so back in the days of municipal courts, which we don't have anymore, you needed a minimum of 5 years of legal
Right.
experience. And do you feel that the work that you had done up to that point prepared you for that position?
Sure. Well, it helped, but nothing prepares you for the first small claims case you have in and people hate each other and are arguing. I think it's more your temperament, and you either like that kind of work or you don't.
You had to go from being an advocate to making decisions. How difficult was that for you, if at all?
It wasn't. I hope I made right decisions, but I was never one that, wrung my hands and struggled. I would look at an issue, and in fact, my clerk gave me a little story that I kept on my desk. I still have it. It was a quote from Sandra Day O'Connor, who's my heroine, and I always took it to heart. She said that she always put all her effort in on the front end, and she worked very, very hard. And then she'd make her decision, and then she'd let it go because she knew she'd put it all in on the front end, and after that, it's done. So
would you then describe your first judicial experience as really in a positive light?
Well, my first judicial experience, our presiding judge, you obviously were trial judge, and you know what rolls downhill. And the people that are new are the ones that get what gets to the bottom of the hill first. And he assigned me my very first day, a jury trial with two lawyers that absolutely hated each other. And they were notoriously, they're very good lawyers, very talented, but they just couldn't stand each other.
They were going to make for a difficult trial.
Yes, and I don't think any of the others wanted to do the trial, so guess what? The new kid gets it. And it was a DUI, and the DUI cases in those days were pretty complex because you were hearing expert testimony and making rulings on foundational issues, and that's where those cases were won and lost. And so it was challenging. And I made it. I feel I earned my stripes, and we got through it. And we didn't have any fisticuffs, which had happened with these two. They'd broken into fights before. And we made it. And I can't remember what happened. I don't know if the guy got convicted or not. I can't remember. But I do remember thinking to the presiding, thanks a lot.
Well, but did it seem to you that because he had put you in this difficult position that perhaps now the remaining cases that you were going to hear were going to be a lot easier to deal
yeah,
with?
maybe. Let's go with that. That's a good one. And we're friends. I mean, he was a very good judge. But I valued, and again, looking back on it, I never got coddled, ever. And I am glad about that. I think that helped.
Now, thinking back on it, do you think that you were assigned this particular trial to really test you, or was it something else?
I don't think the motivation was good.
And do you think, because at the time you had, maybe 5 years of experience, and you were obviously a very young judge, did that play into it at all, do you think?
Yes, I do.
But that didn't stop you, did it?
No,
5 years down the line, you get another call from the governor's office?
I did. Yeah. And that one, though, was, I knew enough I needed to get to know people. And so I volunteered. I always learn, and this is what I tell new lawyers or new judges, always take the assignments nobody else wants and then do the very best you can, and you will distinguish yourself, and no one will interfere with you because they don't want to do it anyway, and they're just grateful you are. And at that court, nobody wanted to do civil. It's hard for some people to understand because many courts, that's the plum assignment. It was not the plum assignment.
And we're still talking about municipal
court. And I volunteered to do that. They were thrilled. So I was able to run the civil department, put in some rules that I thought would work. But it gets to your question is because I got to know the civil bar. And then they became comfortable with me. And it doesn't matter what you look like or how old you were. They know if you work hard, you listen to them, you do your best, then they at least don't oppose you.
And in some of those civil cases, did you find that there were a lot of self-represented litigants, or were most of your cases in which you had attorneys on both sides?
Surprisingly, it was a good mix of both. I don't think it's that way now, but this was a long time ago, and I suspect attorneys could still afford to take those kind of cases. And I had lots of lawyers. We had Section 1983 jury trial when I was in municipal court, civil rights case out of Los Angeles because it got moved. I remember having to go look up Section 1983 because I'd never read it. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm doing this trial. I better know what the statute says, and did some research. Actually, I attended I had the good fortune to attend a CEB course on it before the trial started, and it was very helpful.
And
this is Muni Court.
Now you mentioned that you became familiar with the civil bar. Prior to that, what challenges did you face in the legal community or with your judicial colleagues? Was there anything in particular that you felt was going on?
Oh, it was all the same stuff like I've been talking about. I had a wonderful relationship with my colleagues, and I don't want to suggest I had otherwise. But they were learning. They've never worked with a woman in that position ever. And I remember I was pregnant with our first child. And the only time I had words with this one judge, he was another presiding. And I came into his chambers. He had a whole group of male attorneys. And we had sort of a running thing going because I always made people stand when I walked into the court. Not because I deserved it, but it was one way that I felt I could command some respect, get them to quiet down, because I did a lot of master calendars, and I think that was one of my talents. Is I can move people through and keep balls going in the air. And so I couldn't get people to shut up. So we would make them stand, and then they would do that. Well, this judge thought that was silly. He was very relaxed in his courtroom style, but he's 6'6", and he should have a different style. But anyway, I remember walking into his chambers with all these male lawyers. There were probably 5 or 6 of them. And he says, okay, let's all stand for the pregnant lady.
Boy, you had a lot of
Rosendo,
really interesting experiences.
You ask any woman that's practiced, that's my age, and you'll hear these stories. These are the things that happen. But that's the only time I remember taking him aside, and I told him that if he ever did that again, I would report him.
And so you mentioned the first time that you got the call, it was from Marvin Baxter. 5 years later, you get another call for the Superior Court. Was it still Marvin Baxter then?
No, it was Terry Flanagan.
Terry Flanagan, okay. And do you recall, were you looking forward to transitioning to Superior Court at the time? Or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I sure was. I loved Muni Court. I loved every job on the trial bench. I loved them all. They were great. But we wanted to move up into the mountains, and that was outside of the municipal court district. So we were renting a place in downtown Bakersfield because I didn't want to get in trouble with any kind of jurisdictional requirements. So that was great. We were able to get rid of the apartment after that.
And you had mentioned earlier that most of these judges were not familiar with working, I guess, with a woman. You became the first female Superior Court judge, is that correct?
Yes, in Kern County.
In Kern County. And and you've mentioned one, any other difficulties or challenges you felt that you faced because of the fact that you were the only female there?
Oh, I could tell you countless stories like I have, but no, I really admired my colleagues. I think once they figured out I was for real and that I worked hard and that I listened to them, I tried to be respectful because that's, I was telling you about my dad, that's how I was raised. Then they chilled out. I had a wonderful experience on the trial court bench and I was never coddled. And I believe that was because ultimately they felt I could handle the job. And to me, there's no higher compliment.
Now, you mentioned you've done a lot of civil work in the municipal court. Did you specialize in any particular area in the Superior Court bench?
Oh yeah, I took they stuck, ooh, that was a faux pas. I had an assignment in an area that I had no training in, family law. That wasn't my favorite, but I was in that for 6 months and then they put me in running the criminal calendar. Which in Kern County is a big deal because there's a lot of crime there. And I ran the whole department. Again, I don't know what their motivation was in putting me in that assignment. I did that for a year and I had 2 little kids and it was 24/7. We ran everything. I can't tell you how many sentencings I did and how many motions to suppress I heard. And those were controversial in Kern County. You suppress evidence. They kept book on judges. But that's just the job. Probation revocations, prison. I would hear all kinds of things. We had prisoners in, but I liked the inmates. I never had problems. We never had problems. I always felt that if you talk to people just like as they are, real people that have had moments in their lives, with very rare exceptions, I never had problems.
And you mentioned family law, and that's, I think, probably an area that most judges don't care to do. Is that, you think that might be the reason that you were
I think people
first placed there?
Either love it or they don't. And it's a shame because I think people that love it should do it because it's so important. It's so important. Same with juvenile. I think it's so important that you have someone there that really loves kids or really cares about the community.
And both are very specialized areas of law.
Very, very specialized. And it wasn't so much that way then. But now, I think it's risky to, like they did when I was a judge, it always seemed like if you had expertise in an area, that would be the last assignment you would get.
And that's so very true. I still hear that from new judges. And so this was when you started doing the criminal calendar. How long did you end up doing that?
A year. And then they asked me if I would take over direct calendar for civil. And oh, yes. So I did.
And so that would have been a year into your stint with the Superior Court?
Yes.
Thereabouts? Okay, or a year and a half. And did you enjoy that?
I loved it. I loved it. There were 3 of us that did it. Kern County had been one of the 5 worst counties in the state for getting cases processed quickly. And so we were chosen as a poster child. We had to change our ways. And Art Wallace, who was on the Superior Court, wrote the rules and put this program together. And he selected me and Steve Gildner, my friend, that I mentioned earlier. We were, it was like a little law firm. We had a wonderful time together. I loved it. I've never worked harder. I managed 800 cases. And I did all civil trials. And your reward, if you managed to clear your calendar, was to get a criminal case. So we would try maybe 8 or 10 criminal cases a year, and I had a civil trial usually every week. And it was great.
So, what would you say that you enjoyed the most and maybe enjoyed the least as a trial judge?
I loved everything about being a trial judge. I mean, you'd have litigants sometimes that were a little scary. In civil cases, I had more issues with civil litigants than I did with criminal, but I liked it. I liked being a judge.
And we're talking about 17, 18 years ago now,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so any memorable experiences that you want to share about your time on the trial bench? Anything that stands out to you?
No, I think I've covered most of those. I really liked, I do still really like the bench from there. They're a very eclectic group, and I always enjoyed working with them.
And do you feel that after you did the criminal counter that you also may have won over some of your colleagues in the community in that respect?
Maybe.
Well, at some point, didn't you receive Jurist of the Year award from
Yeah,
Clay
oh yeah, I
County?
did. Yeah, I did.
And when was that? Do you remember?
I was at the Court of Appeal, but hadn't been there long. Yes, yes, that's right. I did. Yeah, and it was well attended, so they must have, and they didn't have to go because I wasn't on the trial bench anymore.
Well,
I forgot about that.
It seems to me that I think you did win folks over, perhaps with your style, perhaps with the fact that you were taking cases that maybe others didn't want to do, and so that probably had something to do with your going on to the Court of Appeal bench. But before we get there, I don't think we've talked about your children very much. You want to tell us about them? You mentioned being pregnant earlier, but we haven't talked about
that. We have two great kids. One is now 30 and one is 24. Our daughter was born, she was 2 when I went on the municipal court bench. And the most memorable thing about that for me was that she went everywhere. Poor kid. I mean, she went everywhere. I had jury duty. I didn't have a sitter. I took her with me. I mean, she went everywhere. And when I was sworn in for municipal court, my husband was holding her, and she was so excited. She just burst loose from him, and she ran and wrapped herself in my robe and stuck her thumb in her mouth. And of course, what picture do you think was in the news? It was that one. Of course, the downside of that wonderful story is within a month I was getting death threats on her. And that was terrible. I thought, oh, what have I done? So we had to hire guards to protect her. She was in her little preschool. And anyway, but not to take away from a wonderful story, but she went everywhere with me. She attended more women lawyers meetings, California women lawyers. I think that's how she learned to sit still. And she's just a great kid. And then we had our son. I actually went into labor in the middle of a case. So not to get too TMI, but I did. And I was in the middle of picking a jury.
And so how did you handle that? What did you, I mean, did
we
you
took
freak
a recess.
out?
No, it all worked out. Yeah, the lawyers, bless their hearts, they didn't know I was pregnant because, we were in a robe. And I hadn't seen them very much. And I know this only because I ran into one of their wives at a baby store because the baby came 10 days early and I'm on a schedule. And so I wasn't expecting him for 9 days. So that's why I thought I'd get this jury trial done.
Anyway, you weren't going to take any time off.
No, I didn't. Like my son said, Mom, you're a better mom when you're working. And I think it's true.
All right. Can you tell us then a little bit about your decision to apply to the Court of Appeal and
well, it's sort of just like
approach?
The rest. I didn't really want to do it because I loved being a trial judge. And my husband, Ken, encouraged me to do it. And he used the same line on me. And I said, this really isn't going to work. And so anyway, I applied. I thought at the time that it would be a good decision to go back to Fresno because my folks were there. So I applied.
So was the same line you're talking about that, well, if you get it, you can always turn it down, something along those lines?
Something like that.
And so who, if you recall, did you get the call from when you were elevated to that position?
Well, Chuck Pachigian interviewed me man, I can't remember who called. Oh, it was John Davies who called me. Yeah, it was a long time. It was like 18 months that my application was in. I'd kind of forgotten about it, to tell you the truth. I really had. And, you know, I was a reluctant warrior anyway, so.
So you had this beautiful home you mentioned in the mountains,
Yeah.
and many friends now in Kern County. Was it difficult for you to move back to Fresno?
Yeah, it was. It was. I had real hesitation about it, but I did.
And you mentioned that your parents were still here, so that was one thing I suppose that made it a little bit easier for you.
Yes.
And there's a justice by the name of Bill Stone from Bakersfield who
Yes.
was at the 5th District Court of Appeal at that time. Did he help your transition in
Oh,
any
yes. He was actually another part of the reason why I put in for the position, because I just love Bill Stone. He was I had jury trials in front of him. I thought he was just the consummate judge, consummate gentleman, very low key, very kind to me. And I really liked his family. So he was there. He thought it was okay. So I thought, well, if he thinks it's okay, maybe it's okay.
Is he someone that you talked to before you made the application, or
I
as you were
did.
waiting?
I did. I'm sure I did.
And you ended up serving on the Court of Appeal from 1995 through 2013. So was the job everything you hoped it would be? Did you miss the trial bench?
I did miss it. Yes, I did miss the trial bench. I missed my friends. I sound like a high schooler, but I did. I missed my friends and the judges that I worked with. They were such an eclectic group of people, and I missed that about them. Going to the Court of Appeal, what I noticed is that all the judges, except for Justice Stone, were from Fresno, and they'd all formed bonds as trial judges together, or they'd practiced together. So when I first came, I felt like an outsider. I was an outsider, and Kern County was probably not viewed as being the primo county in the district at that time.
Well, you had mentioned the child molest cases. They ended up going to the Court
Yeah.
of Appeal, and
Yeah, they got reversed pretty good.
and so maybe that was part of the reason that you felt. Did you feel that the judges in Kern County were looked down upon by
Yes.
the folks in Fresno?
They did, and they were. I am confident they were. I heard that. I had a couple trial lawyers call me and say, "You need to know what." There was one in particular that had made comments, which I thought was quite unprofessional, about our bench, and that he said to this lawyer that he would start reviewing a record of a Kern County case and presume it was a reversal.
So not exactly the send-off that you were hoping for when you first started.
Yeah.
Did things improve from there, or how did you? You'd won folks over in Kern County. Did you win folks over in Fresno County?
Maybe. It was a harder sell.
Now, during the time that you were at the 5th District Court of Appeal, you decided to pursue an LLM.
Yes.
What motivated you to do so?
Education. It was an opportunity. I couldn't pass it up. I could go to University of Virginia, and I had to take all my vacations and pile them together. But I went for summers and worked my tail off. I took our two kids with us, and they became little street urchins, which was, I think, a great experience for them. All the judges came, and we lived in it's the UVA model where you live on campus, you live with your families, and all the kids became fast friends. And they hung out together. They did I let them do things there that I never would have let them do in Fresno. I mean, they ran around and explored and played, and we did all the things you do in that area, floated down the James River, explored historical places, and the caliber of the education was just so intoxicating. I couldn't say no, and it was an opportunity to go, and they would pay for your education.
Now, did I hear you mention that the other judges that were also going through this, had their families there or their children
Yes,
there?
many of them did.
Okay.
It was great. It was such a communal experience. And the caliber of the professors was fabulous. I mean, that's where CJA got a lot of their connections to bring out these incredible educators. Michael Klarman, who is often quoted in Justice Scalia opinions, his opinions and the types of things that he wrote. And I've never had professors like that. Was my law school experience. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. Studied economics, and it was fabulous.
So you mentioned that this law school experience was much different from your earlier experience at Davis. Is that
Yes,
fair to say?
was wonderful. I loved it.
And did you learn anything that you feel helped you to either approach decision making or opinion writing?
Yes. The most significant was my studying economics. And I think it should be mandatory education for every attorney is to take economics and to understand, or for judges at least, to understand the implications of your decisions. Not that you make a decision on the basis of how it's going to impact money-wise. It's just you need to understand that there are these causation issues. If you do A, B will happen. And are you sure you want B to happen? It's a policy consideration. And it opened my eyes to those types of things. And it influenced decisions that I had. It most definitely did.
It seems to me that would be something important to have. Because, I think as judges, or certainly judges on the Court of Appeal, sometimes you ask, well, I wonder why they did this, and I wonder why I did that. Do you think maybe economics might have been behind some of those decisions that were made below or were being made on appeal?
I do. If not, maybe should have been, but yes. Although it depends on how you approach it.
So it seems to me you loved education because when you weren't a student, you were teaching.
Yeah.
Tell us about your teaching experience and why you enjoyed it so much.
You know, that's a good question. I don't know. I just love it. It forced me to learn new things, and I do like that. And I like, maybe it was my law school experience, I like to try and learn something so well that you can make it sound so easy that people want to hear. And I've always been put off by people that you can't understand. And I don't think it's because they're so smart. I think that they can't communicate. And I've done a lot of teaching with, I used to do a lot of teaching with the California Judges Association. Art Gilbert and I do a civil law update gig, which is so much fun to do with him. I've done a lot with the Rudder Group. Well, I think I've been teaching with the Rudder Group for 20 years. And in fact, even as we speak, I've got a program in a week that I'm doing on employment law.
Did you ever teach at a law school?
Yes, I did. I taught at a law school in Bakersfield. I taught what I wished I had been told, and it was about civil procedure before trial. And so we put people through their paces, how to write a demur, how to respond to a demur, how to do a motion for summary judgment, how to write a settlement conference statement, how to do a 998 offer, things like that.
Tell us a little bit about some of your published writings. You mentioned the Rudder Group, but any writings other than appellate opinions that have been published that you were either enjoyed doing or proud of, whatever you can think of?
Well, two in particular. One is I'm an author for the Rudder Group on employment litigation, and I've been doing that for a long time. We are in the middle of finishing our updates now, and I do enjoy that very much. And since I've retired, I'm even enjoying it more because I have a little bit more time to digest the material. And I love doing that. And I also wrote my thesis for the LLM was on judicial retention elections and what's in a name. And I did a regression analysis for all names from mid-appellate level retention elections in California from 1984 until whatever the current time was. And we did this regression analysis where you would assign a value on the basis of the nature of the name, whether it was a Germanic sounding name, whether it was a name that sounded like it was female, hyphenated names, Latino sounding names, Latina. And we crunched all the numbers and came up with percentages as to how that likely impacted the number of people that voted for you.
And what did you find?
We found lots of interesting things. First of all, being a woman helped. That was the first time I ever knew being female helped. Discovered that, and this was a little while ago, and I hope things have changed, but if your name sounded Jewish, that did not help. You would lose maybe 2 percentage points less than someone else. Having a Latino sounding name would reduce the results, even in the 2nd district, which I was a little surprised about, because I felt that was counterintuitive because of the larger Hispanic population, but ultimately put that off to the fact that maybe Hispanic people weren't voting. I don't know, but that is anecdotal. Hyphenated names didn't matter. Names that sounded familiar, what was it? Orville Jack Armstrong. He got the highest percentage of votes of anybody. And he was a great judge, but nobody really knew his writings. It was just, he sounded like a radio personality. And it was like that.
It was good to have a name like Hollis Best, maybe?
Oh, Hollis Best, another, high scorer. Who could vote against someone who had the last name Best? And at that time, there was no information available about judges. So you truly, if you voted, were going on the basis either of what some lawyer told you that you knew or what you thought the name sounded like.
There's not a whole lot of information regarding the appellate justices that are on the ballot. Is that still true today, you think?
You can get it, but it's not on the ballot. Like League of Women Voters, there are ways to get the information. Most of them are good, but there are some groups that put information out and suggest how you should vote on somebody based on who appointed them, which I find troubling.
Now as an associate justice, you authored more than 160 published opinions covering many significant legal issues. And of course, you also authored many unpublished opinions. But let's start with civil cases. Are there any cases that stand out in particular to you?
Well, two. One is the California Voting Rights Act case with the city of Modesto. That was significant to me. We determined that it was constitutional, facially constitutional, which now seems kind of a no-brainer. But at the time, it was pretty out there.
This is Sanchez versus City of Modesto?
Yes, Sanchez versus City of Modesto.
And notice that in that case, they actually filed a cert in the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was denied.
Yes.
So it sounds like it might have been of national significance, at least to these parties. Were there any amicus briefs filed in that case?
Oh, yes. Yes. And to me, it's significant because I think it impacted regular people's lives, and it still is. You still see this issue. I was reading the Maddie report today, and there's several stories in there. Even today, they have in Merced, they're having an election, whether they're going to vote by way of district or at-large elections. And so it's still very much alive. So I thought that was important. The other case that sort of struck me as important, at least to me, was the Protect Our Water case.
This is the California Environmental Act case.
Right. But it was really an appellate case because it was about how to make an adequate record. And I remember the staff attorney that was working with me on this case, we just threw our arms up because we couldn't figure out the record. It was a mess. And so we decided, this is not our job to make the record and put it together. So I had been told by many counsel that case had an impact. And this gets back to the economics issue. People now prepare their records because they have an economic interest in doing so because they don't want to do it again.
So you would think that this did have an impact on the entities such as the counties or other entities that usually are charged with keeping and making a record?
Yes, I know it did. They've told me, and people have told me that over the years. I mean, not everybody liked it, that's for sure, but I understand that.
Well, they may not have liked it, but it has helped in the development of the law, at least on appeal, with regard to those secret cases. Would you say that?
I think so. Correct. I think so, and I think in a good way. It's just you get used to doing it right the first time, and then that becomes the standard.
And any criminal cases, does any particular criminal case stand out in your mind, and if so, why?
Well, one case stands out in my mind. It was when I was in municipal court. It was a gang rape case, and it just stuck out to me because I was very young. The victim was male, and there were 3 defendants, all male. There were 3 defense lawyers, all male, and the court reporter was male, and the victim was male, and he was brutally raped, and I was the only woman in the whole room. And I remember looking at him. I thought there was sort of a divine moment. I think he had an easier time testifying because I was there. And I thought, how ironic. This is always, I think it's always happened, these types of horrible crimes to men and women, but men never talked about it. And I felt I was really at the right place at the right time to offer comfort to make the situation as easy as it could be, because it was a terrible situation for everybody. And I recall the defendants were not very nice people. They had very lengthy records. It was a preliminary hearing, so there wasn't much question they were going to be bound over. But I'll never forget that experience.
Was that something that happened in the jail, or do you remember?
It happened in the jail. Mm-hmm, yeah, and this poor kid, he shouldn't have done it, but he was joyriding. Obviously, he didn't sign up for that.
And so that, I suppose, tells us a little bit about how important it is to house inmates in the appropriate areas based on their backgrounds.
Exactly.
And so, as far as collegiality on the Court of Appeal, reaching agreement on cases, how important was that to you as an appellate justice?
It was important. A lot of our cases at the 5th District are criminal, and so they were different as far as we would get together and talk about them. The civil cases were where I felt there was more of a challenge, because that's when people's judicial philosophies tended to come into conflict sometimes. But I was never one that liked to do memos. I don't get this memos thing where you write up something and then send it to your colleague. If you have questions, you go sit down and talk to them. And I always tried to do that to the extent they were willing to listen. I had some colleagues that didn't want to do it that way, and I think looking back on it, they were not able to learn through oral listening. I've since learned as a teacher that people learn different ways, and it isn't personal, but some people like to write it out. That's how they learn, and that's how they can assimilate information. And if you go and sit down in front of them and start, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? They don't respond well to it. And you have to figure out who is like that and not be offended by it.
So there was plenty of give and take. It just sometimes had to take different forms, oral or written.
Yeah, you kind of have to learn who your people are and learn what works for them. And sometimes you step in it until you learn that, but none of us on the Court of Appeal are hopefully slow learners. You pick up on it and then approach them in the way they are comfortable.
Concurring and dissenting opinions. Under what circumstances do you believe that separate opinions should be written?
Concurring opinions are important. I've been reading the California Supreme Court, and I've really appreciated the value of concurring opinions, more so now than I did before. With Justice Liu, I read a lot of employment cases, and I think his concurring opinions are really good. He's very scholarly in how he approaches things, and I think that is an appropriate use of a concurring opinion.
Is that maybe for the development of the law? Is it?
Yeah, and sometimes the opinions, maybe because he's a professor, I don't mean to just focus on him, but Sometimes we as appellate justices, you only decide the issue in front of you, and that's the appellate way. But sometimes it's helpful to give a little bit more guidance, especially in areas where the world is changing so much. Class action litigation is a primo example, and sometimes I think concurring opinions can, at that level, can be very helpful. I would not be too thrilled about writing a concurring opinion in an unpublished case if I didn't feel strongly about it, because in some ways you were just poking a colleague in the eye. But in dissent, I wrote some dissenting opinions that I know upset colleagues quite a bit, and they would go from the case was going to be published to you writing a dissent, and then all of a sudden, well, I guess we're not going to publish on this case after all.
Are there any dissenting opinions or concurring opinions that stand out in your mind? And so
Well, one of the more interesting dissents I wrote was fairly recently. It was Ralph's grocery case, and it had to do with union picketing at the front of a it was in the front of a grocery store, and that was hotly contested, and it went up for review, and I wrote a dissent in that case. It was friendly. Everybody agreed to disagree, but I actually wrote a dissent. I didn't really like my opinion, but I felt it was what the law required.
Was that case taken up, you know?
Yeah, it was.
Is it still pending?
No, it's done.
Did the Supreme Court side with you?
They did. I mean, they don't always side with me, but they did this time.
Those are gratifying, I guess, once you've had more than one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you know, they go the other way too. Yeah.
So how would you describe your judicial philosophy, and how, if at all, has it changed from your Munich court days to your last days on the 5th District Court of Appeal?
Well, I guess when I was on the trial bench, I wanted people to feel they had their say. It was very important to me. They had their say, and that they had a chance to be heard. At the Court of Appeal, I suppose some of my philosophy was do no harm, and listen to people, but don't be afraid to speak out on cutting edge issues if that's what you feel is warranted. Sometimes at the court, you're in the opportunity to make bellwether calls, and you know them when you see them.
So it's a slightly different approach. Certainly when you have litigants in front of you, you want them to feel as though the process worked for them,
Right.
fairness and being heard.
And I did carry that through. When we would have, these horrible cases where you have children that have been taken away from parents, and they're almost always pro per, and the standard of review is such that there's no real possibility that the judge is going to be reversed. I would always let the parent cry and talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. I felt it was cruel to tell them, well, you know, this isn't part of the record, and we all knew that. But that was one time where I would just let them speak, and I felt that was important. They're going to lose because of the rules of the appellate process. They didn't make their record, but that doesn't mean that we need to lecture them.
Now, the 5th District covers numerous counties. Was there ever a time during which, and it's based in Fresno, was there ever a time in which the court went out to any of the outlying communities and told court?
Yes.
And
Yes.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, we were the first court to ever do it, and I ran the show. Our presiding judge didn't want to do it, and I just felt it was so important I did it anyway, which was not maybe the most prudent call, but we did. And we had real PR problems in Kern County. They didn't like the Court of Appeal going back to those molest cases. They felt they were picked on by the 5th District Court of Appeal. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But anyway, we went down there and held court, brought in high school students. It was packed. People never had seen the Court of Appeal in operation. And the first one we did filled an auditorium. They brought kids from all over the county and brought them in.
So these were used also as an educational tool?
Yes. Yes, and then the judges would open themselves up to question, and nothing was scripted. But I was proud of them. That was not easy for them. I like that, but I know not everybody does. And they handled it well.
And now settlement conferences on appeals, I guess I'm not necessarily heard of. Did you do any settlement conferences on appeals?
Yes, me and Justice Kane and I, Justice Kane and me, whatever, we put together a mediation program, one of the first of its kind, where the justices at the 5th District Court of Appeal screen all civil cases that come in and do mediations at no cost to the litigants.
Do you remember how long ago that you began to implement these mediation conferences?
Let's see, I've been gone. Maybe it's been about 3 years. Yeah, because we did it together. It was fun.
How would you gauge the success?
I think it was great. I don't know what you're doing now, but I settled some cases, and I know Justice Kane did, and Justice Cornell, and probably Justice Franson too, maybe Justice Levy, that would never have settled without that. And they didn't have to write briefs, they didn't have that added expense. But I did that one case that I'll never forget as long as I live. It was a drowning case where the father died in the arms of the family because of a flash flood. And, it was destined for litigation forever. It took us a year to do it. But we got it done. And went back to the courtroom where the case was tried, and that's where we put it on the record.
So it wasn't there at the Court of Appeal, you went out to the...
I did. I'd go wherever they were, because I'm up in the Bay Area, so they were in Modesto, and that's where all the family was. So I often would hold the mediation in Modesto.
You take mediations on the road?
On the road, yeah, why not?
What major challenges do you believe that the judicial system faces today?
Irrelevance. The shine is gone. We're just another governmental agency. When I started, it was special, and it still is. But the money issue and the asking for money constantly, I think the computer issue, the failed development of that really took the polish off. It made the judiciary look like it didn't know what it was doing. Whether that is accurate or not, I have no opinion, but that's how it appeared.
Self-inflicted wounds, would you say? Or?
Yeah, it would be accurate. And that's the way the press covered it, and then you have fewer legislators that are lawyers or have any understanding or interest in the law. It just diminishes the branch, and you don't normally bargain well if you're not coming at it from strength.
So do you think that our most recent Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court is faced with additional challenges?
Yeah, I think she's doing an amazing job, but it's got to be hard. And she took on a hard situation because that was all happened before she got on the job.
It kind of all fell on her lap as she took that
right.
office.
And she's been so positive and never lets her guard down. But that's hard.
Can you give us your observations or comments on the changing views of judicial ethics, civility in the courtroom, the impact of technology, and on the challenges of greater sensitivity to the avoidance of bias?
Well, I think with all the educational requirements that judges and employers must give their employees, it is changing. Some of the stories I was telling you, it wouldn't happen today. And that's important. By the same token, that doesn't mean that people don't feel those things. They're just much more subtle. But we've had some recent pretty serious breaches ethics-wise. Even out of Kern County, there were a couple where inappropriate sexual relationships between judges and attorneys or litigants. Sometimes you just can't legislate brains. It's like my daughter sent me a copy of a story and just said, felony dumb. how do you teach people not to do those kind of things? But it just points out that the judiciary, attorneys, we're all people, and people make mistakes and do dumb things.
There's still plenty of work to be done in that area.
Yeah, but there always will be. There always will be. But as long as we're trying, I think that's all anyone can ask.
Fair enough. Tell us about your decision to retire. What have you been doing since your retirement?
Well, I'm still writing for the Rudder Group. I love it. And that's almost a full-time job, at least for 4 or 5 months of the year. It's very active. I'm still teaching with them. I also love gardening, and I love color. I love design and style and texture. I love it. I always have. I also am doing floral design, 6-foot large arrangements. I do them every week, and I'm also teaching flower arranging. It's fun.
So you've been doing lots of gardening things that you really enjoy.
Oh yes, yeah. I've always done it, but it's been always good therapy. My husband says he thinks it's cheaper than therapy, but I'm not really sure.
So far, I guess no regrets about the retirement decision?
No, not that I have any. I loved the position, and frankly, if I'd been in Fresno, I wouldn't have. But the drive was beginning to get to me. You kind of feel like every time you get home, it was a good day. It's like dodgeball on the freeway.
So what advice would you give someone who is considering a career in law?
Think long and hard. If you do it, don't go in necessarily thinking you're going to practice. Keep your options open. Recognize it's expensive to go. And if you don't have a good nest egg, think hard and long about it. I wouldn't be advising anybody necessarily to go unless they really knew what they wanted to do when they got out, because otherwise it can be postponing the job search and you end up with a mortgage and no house.
So 2 past members of your research staff have become judicial officers. What advice would you give someone who is considering a career as a judicial officer?
Oh, be like them. I knew when I met these 2 particular staff attorneys that they were destined for great things. It's just who they are. Be involved in your community, and I don't mean like join things, do things, be the president, run the show, be involved politically. It is a political appointment, and that is important. Don't sit on your laurels. Always be pushing yourself. And be out there, be in the mix. If you're not, you can be a wonderful scholar, and that's great. That'll qualify you to be an incredible research attorney at the Court of Appeal. But to be on the bench, you need to do more.
How important is it to get along with others in terms of the legal profession? Does that factor into being able to perhaps get a judicial appointment?
Oh yeah, you need to know them first of all, and it's helpful if they like you, which means that you listen to them and you cooperate with them, and you don't poke them in the eye. That's helpful. It's like play well with others.
Keep a good reputation, I guess. Is that how we can sum that up?
Yes.
After your retirement, you received the Rose Bird Award from the California Women Lawyers. Tell us a little bit about the award and tell us what it meant to you to receive it.
It was great. I thought I was done, and I got the call about the award, and I thought, what? What is this? It surprised me, and it was a terrific experience. And having friends come, people that I haven't seen, and to be there. I don't like necessarily spotlight kind of things about me. I like spotlight where I'm teaching or I'm working with others. I love that, but I don't like it where it's on me exclusively. But it was so gratifying to have dear friends. I mean, you came and spoke, and I'll never forget it. It was wonderful. And I have always had a high opinion of the California Women Lawyers. I've been a member of that forever, I think since just about when it started. And it was such an incredible honor.
Did you feel that based on the attendance and some of the things that were said, and of course the award itself, that you may have had an impact on women in the
I did.
profession?
It was nice. You know, I forget about things. Something happens, and I don't think about it anymore. And it was nice to. Sometimes it's nice to recall where you've been.
All right. We're pretty much done here. If you had to do it all over again, is there anything that you would change regarding your career?
No. Maybe I would have started arranging flowers sooner. I don't know, but no, I have no complaints, and I'm not done. I look at this as just the start, and I'm happy.
And is there anything that you've thought about at this point that you might still want to pursue, or is it you're just going to leave the door open, or how are you feeling right now?
Door's open, but at this point, I don't anticipate practicing law. Who knows? Maybe someday I would do some mediations for maybe like foundations, folks that can't afford it and need help. That I could see myself doing.
So you're talking about a whole new chapter then. You're thinking that the book is open, a whole new chapter. Doesn't have to do necessarily with law or decision making, which you've done for so long.
Yeah. My only decisions I'm making is if I go out to dinner, what am I going to order?
Well, again, thank you so very much for agreeing to participate in this interview. I believe that this is a great way to keep the history of the Court of Appeal, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here with you. I hope that you've enjoyed it as well, and that you had an opportunity to say the things that you hoped you could say.
Yes, I did. Thank you, Rosendo.